Cruise is made possible thanks to those who donate to the show at japanbyrivercruise.com and due to the generosity of our corporate sponsors. This week's show is brought to you by Cowboy Bebop.
Netflix's live-action Cowboy Bebop Season 1 is out, and the reviews are in. Critics are calling it a rare success, a breath of fresh air, slick and spirited, colorless and soulless, a cosmic disaster, everything wrong with nostalgia reboots, and, as the New York Times puts it, it's okay. It's not an embarrassment. But who cares what the critics are saying? We're Netflix, and it was content, so we made it. And it's there, so you'll watch it. Substance-wise, it's no Squid Game, which is also on Netflix. And for the art direction, it'll make you miss the original anime, which is also on Netflix. Kabe Bibi, from Netflix. We'll see you at the bank. Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
Hiya, I'm Ollie Horn.
And joining us this week is Thalia Harris, writer for Unseen Japan, whose most recent piece on the lesser-known Zoku, or tribes of Japan, includes an in-depth look into the Kawakudari Zoku. It's a must-read for any river cruise aficionado. Thalia, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
On this week's show, the corona pandemic has forced a lot of acceleration in Japan, in areas like the adoption of cashless payments, remote work, and more. But it's also accelerated some negative things as well. For instance, entire generations of foreigners who shouldn't have been fully disillusioned with Japan until their mid-40s are getting there in record time. We'll talk to Thalia about the ways in which Japan has made it clear that foreigners are second-class citizens, and how this affects Japan's present and future. Plus, Ollie's got your weekly river cruise recommendation. Ollie?
That was one of our bleakest intros ever, Bobby. Even the otherwise good jokes didn't really make me want to listen to this show, nor indeed record it. So let's go. Anyway, this week's recommendation was going to be Osaka's cutting-edge NFT river cruise. NFT, of course, short for non-fungible Titanic. Unfortunately, we received some bad news just before recording that on its maiden voyage, the cruise ship was in fact funged.
And you accuse me of bleakness. And in other industry news, the JRCA has published an open letter to ZozoTown founder Maezawa Yusaku, whose real Twitter handle is @YouSuck2020, as he continues to undergo the more than 100 tests he needs to pass to qualify for space travel. The organization hopes to convince him of the appeal of river travel as well, by highlighting the scenery, the camaraderie, and the fact that in order to board a riverboat, you only need to pass one test, the test of whether or not you have 600 yen. All that coming up, but first, Soap Talk. Unfortunately, Brian couldn't be here this week. He is using his paid vacation time to interview for positions on other podcasts.
We support that. Thalia.
Yes.
You are a writer. You said yes, not only to acknowledge your presence, but also to give me reassurance that I've not pronounced your name wrong. Right. And I'm grateful for that. And what's great is that came through in the audio. Although you write for Unseen Japan, we can see you, which is good. Our listeners can't, so that's kind of irrelevant. Mm-hmm. We've had people associated with Unseen Japan before. We've briefly discussed some controversy, which we're not going to bring up on this show. So let's focus on the positives. What do you get out of writing for Unseen Japan?
The biggest thing I get is creativity and freedom to just pretty much pitch. Most of everything I've written on there was usually based on a pitch I did. Like the very first piece I wrote for them was for about a super obscure movie that I saw in college one time. You know,
right?
And the fact that at the time, I believe this is back when Jay was the main editor, right? So the fact that he was so receptive to that, he's like, sure, do it. And I feel like
super obscure movie, as long anything that's unseen matches with everything.
Indeed, it unseen except if you were in gender studies at a college in 2010.
Let me ask that question. Has anyone seen this movie? No. Sold.
Exactly. I'm like, that was my topic. I'm like, no one knows about this movie. I should write about it. Exactly.
Yeah.
That was the process.
And in reading your articles, it's clear that you don't just use them to explore Japan, but also explore your own kind of personal views and the way that you fit into the country. And I think Unseen Japan has adopted that position of part kind of journalism and exposition pieces, but also a bit of activism and kind of taking a stance on certain issues. Have you had any articles where you've had any pushback, or where you thought, oh, maybe I've pushed this a bit too far? Or
I would say we did have an experience like that, meaning myself and a few other people, because it was all about the same topic. I wouldn't say I felt I went too far, but we definitely, what was it? It was the piece where I talked about how Japanese people were not happy about the Olympics happening during the pandemic, and this was before the rollout was complete.
Right.
The thing is, I don't feel like I said anything controversial, especially considering that I literally just translated and said what Japanese people said, right? And a very common, point of contention that some people have with our publication is that, oh, they're speaking for Japanese people. They're Westerners putting, words in their mouth. Leave the innocent Japanese people alone.
How dare you? How dare you go to the effort of translating what Japanese people say in English?
How dare you tell us what Japanese people are saying and not what we think they should be saying because we think they're innocent little children? How dare you? And so to sum it up, I basically said, hey, these Japanese people and many others don't want this to happen. They had a trending topic about it. They're like, why the hell is everyone coming over here? This is ridiculous. And someone who claimed to be an immunologist, I say claim because I feel like, I'm sorry. I say claim because I feel like if you're an immunologist, then why are you against the idea of people being vaccinated before a major sports event?
Can I also just ask, was this immunologist someone on Twitter without a proper handle who was shouting at you?
Yes.
I don't think they're an immunologist then. I think if you're an immunologist in the middle of a global pandemic, you've got bigger fish to fry.
Right. That's the thing. And he was like an immunologist based in Japan, and he had experience, and he gave me all these percentages. Like, I think I said, because at the time, I think the vaccination rate was, 10%. He's like, actually, it's 11 as of this week. So you're rounded down to 10. It's still 10.
He sounds like one of those assistant immunologists where there's an actual Japanese immunologist doing most of the work, and he's just there for show.
Oh, absolutely. No, it would not be the first time they put a random white man for show in Japan. Let me tell you, it would not be the first time. There's a whole industry based around white dudes who officiate weddings, but that's not the point. The point is that he
look at Bobby's face right now. Look at Bobby's face right now.
I've never accepted one of those jobs. I've been offered them numerous times.
Oh, okay, that's why you're smiling.
Never taken one.
You had a flashback. I see.
Yeah.
But to be clear, Bobby has taken jobs with considerably less credibility, and he's considerably less qualified.
I'm proud to say I've never been a fake priest. If you ask me a question about whether or not I've been a Santa Claus, I will turn off my microphone.
Santa Claus is more, I would say Santa Claus is an honorable position, but at any rate, I think this was indicative of not only his, him just hating, us because we said something, but also it's just that classic Twitter argument where, like, if you don't think of every possible counter argument, then automatically you're wrong. So my main idea was Japan should be vaccinated before they have the Olympics, because it's a major world event, and you got people coming from all over different strains. To which he interpreted it as, so what you're saying is that rich countries should have vaccines before poor countries? And we're just like, where did you get that?
That's that whole, if you say on Twitter you love pancakes, someone will go, why do you hate waffles?
Exactly. Perfect. Yeah. Exactly. So
I'm gluten intolerant. This is not nice.
Exactly. I'm anti poor country apparently. Anyway, so to sum it up, we talked about it in the Slack of we're all going to block them, but that's really the most pushback I've ever gotten, maybe.
Yeah. So not just you as a writer for Unseen Japan, but I think a lot of the other writers as well, their pieces run the gamut from introducing aspects of Japanese art or fashion or subculture to kind of more politically themed pieces. How do you strike a balance between, celebrating the aspects of Japan that you love and also criticism of Japan where criticism is due?
I just work in the sense of good faith. I work in the sense of, at the end of the day, this is an information. You know what I mean? This is based on information, based on exposing people to ideas and, or just facts that they never considered before. Like, there was that one piece I wrote about the only Japanese survivor of the Titanic, What was his name? Hosono Masabumi. And it was important to note that because in that case, he was treated unfairly because he was Japanese around a bunch of rich white folk. But then on the other hand, you have the tension, but you have that, the tension about K-pop and J-pop and why there's that tension. Well, Japan colonized Korea for a very long time. So it's really just about what the article calls for in that moment and what's the main idea I'm trying to get through, and to understand that I criticize America too, but I love being from America. I criticize Japan sometimes because I've invested a lot of time here, and I know that it's good to have a balance of things to live a full life. You can't just be praising everything, but you absolutely can't be downing everything as well. Yeah. Because it's just going to be a very unlayered and quite frankly boring experience, in my opinion.
How many other Japanese people were there on the Titanic?
Man, we should just do a whole episode of the Titanic, now, shouldn't we? It's technically not a river cruise, so we're cool.
I believe he was, if not one of the few, he was the only. Hence why he's known as the only Japanese survivor.
Well, if he was the only one and also the only survivor, I mean, that's a great Japanese survival rate for the Titanic.
Oh, listen,
that's
yes.
a 100% survival rate.
He was disgraced for years afterwards, and it wasn't until many years later he cleared his name. And then his grandson formed 1/3 of Yellow Magic Orchestra. It got better.
Cleared his name of what? Did they think that he did it?
Yeah, well, to sum it up, like, he survived, right? But then, how do I say this? So at the time, this was like the Taisho period, right? And the Taisho period was all about embracing Western ideas. Yeah. And so let Westerners tell it. They're saying, oh, they're mad that he didn't go down with the ship because the Japanese are samurai, which is no.
What?
At that point, the samurai was no longer a thing. The reason why Japanese were upset was because they're basically like, you were cowardly and you embarrassed us in front of Western people. And like, and he got back and he was just so happy to be home and, you know, be with his wife and children. And then he got fired from his job, but then they rehired him because no one else could do his job. But he was just working a contract thing and no longer full-time. And then he died in disgrace, and it wasn't until I think like the 80s that his son put out an article saying my father was not a coward. And then when the Titanic movie came out in 97, I think another piece was put out to prove that Hosono was not a coward, or sorry, Masabumi, as his name, was not a coward. But I think at this point it's been so long ago that most people don't really care that much. So
I'm surprised they cared at the time.
Me too.
Like, chill out, Japan. Leonardo DiCaprio wasn't going to fuck him anyway.
I know, right? Not even his ancestor. It was crazy. It was wild.
Talking of people that are never going to fuck us, Bobby, did we get any coffees this week?
What a weird way to lead into that.
I've got to get there somehow. We've overrun Soap Talk.
Yeah. Selena Hoy bought us a coffee. She wrote, "Thanks for today's show," referencing the show we did with Motoko Rich. People love Motoko Rich. The show with her has gotten a huge positive reaction. Much better than that time that we did a show with Motoko Lower Middle Class.
Very good. The jokes just keep coming on this show. We're doing so well. We ought to get her back. She was very good. And did we got another coffee?
Somebody bought us 5 coffees, and they listed their name as Nobody. So nobody bought us 5 coffees. That's right. Who's buying us coffees? Nobody.
Very good.
Which makes it easier to ask for more.
Yeah. Can nobody buy us any coffees this week, please? For those that are not au fait with how we work, the only way this show is supported is when our listeners buy us coffees for money. And we prefer it when you pay for the monthly subscription, meaning that you get access to extras. Unfortunately, no access to extras with our guest this week. We have special extras for just me and Bobby.
You can listen to the extras to find out what au fait means. It's the second time Ollie's used it in conversation tonight. I think he must have learned it this week.
I'm surprised it's my kuchi. Is it kuchiguse?
Kuchiguse, yeah.
Yeah, that's a Japanese word that's now going to become your kuchiguse.
Your verbal
if you didn't know
habit.
what the word kuchiguse was in Japanese. Jesus, we're overrunning so badly. Don't laugh at us. We're normally very good at this.
No, I'm not laughing. That's the first time I've ever heard a British person, I assume you British, use the word au fait. I'm just like, oh man.
Merci beaucoup. Allons-y, Bobby. Aux nouvelles. Bobby Judo, qu'est-ce qui se passe in the news this week?
The corona pandemic has ruined the long-term plans of many Japanophiles worldwide, but it's also created a huge amount of disillusionment for non-Japanese residents of Japan who've seen the way the government treats them as second-class citizens. Thalia, you wrote a great piece on this in Unseen Japan. Was there a moment for you during the pandemic that was just the breaking point, the wara that broke the Rakuda's back, if you will?
Oh man, I would say there were two. One was definitely had to be when my uncle passed away at the top of the year, which was actually before the pandemic hit. And I would say this, it wasn't so much the fact that it happened and then the fact that I couldn't go home for the memorial.
Right.
That sucked. I had to watch it through Facebook Live. It was the fact that the overall months-long grieving process, I could not go through that with my family.
Right.
That was the worst part. The fact that I had to watch my parents pretty much, mourn, and I couldn't be there for them, and then I had to mourn by myself. That was rough. Another major point for me there were quite a few. How do I say this? Like, they were just, I'm not getting sad. I'm actually trying to recollect because it was a wild year. But I think it would have to be the protests that happened back in summer 2020 with George Floyd's murder and all that. And it just kind of felt like, damn, I'm here in Japan and I'm stuck here, but then I'm back home and everything's on fire. Damn it! So it just kind of felt like it felt like a very weird space of where do I go? What do I do?
Sure. Well, we weren't expected to bring this up, but since you have. It's interesting that you mentioned the George Floyd movement in America, because there was loads of big political movements in America that I'm sure people during the pandemic felt very distant from. But the BLM protests were one of the very few that had a bit of cut through in Japan.
Right.
Where there were regional protests, and that must have been really interesting for you, that you could connect with what was going on in America, not in a literal sense, but in a kind of a vicarious sense here in Japan.
Right, exactly. It kind of, I will say, it gave me a sense of optimism where it's like, okay, at least there is a vocal minority that understands what's going on, because I think, things get very mixed up in the news and all that stuff. You just see a bunch of, people looting and lighting stuff on fire. And then the average Japanese person may look at that and say, oh, America's scary. And it's like, no, it's not scary. It's just that something terrible happened and justice was not brought up and people are angry about it.
Yeah.
And so what I find in Japan when it comes to understanding, world events, especially when it comes to blackness and whiteness in Japan, the first thing a lot of Japanese people are surprised to learn is that there aren't that many black people in America. A lot of them think it's a 50-50 situation, when it's more of like, I think of like a 60-10 situation. And so they just kind of think, oh, everything's equal. It's like, no, it's still a marginalized situation. And that's why it hurts even more when one of us is murdered in such a terrible way.
Yeah. And of course, if you haven't investigated it, you have literally no idea of the expanse of inequality, do you? It's like, even of the black people that live in America, a very large proportion are behind bars, so a Japanese person wouldn't get to interact with them anyway because of inequalities in the justice system. It's like on every level, we can only ever see these problems through through the media, through a prism. And it was just interesting for me that this was one of the first times where that prism was kind of being held and pointed by black people living in Japan.
Exactly. For sure.
So you've got this personal and political and social backdrop that is giving you reasons to want to be able to go back to America, even though you're based in Japan. You've got kind of this pull in both directions, but you've also got this pandemic-driven system that's not allowing you to move freely.
Right.
And you mentioned in your article that idea of, Japanese people always liking to ask, so when are you going back home? And how, even though it's not meant as an offensive question, it still can cut.
Yeah, I think this has happened to all of us, hasn't it? Do you remember the first time you were asked, when are you going home?
Oh, yeah. Like back in 2013 when I first came here, I think I was like 22. And that's like the first question I asked. I was an ALT. And they're like, oh, how long you get? Like, oh, you're from you're New York. Da, 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 da. And it's like, oh, when are you going home? I'm like,
yeah,
maybe a year. I don't know. I'm thinking like, why are you asking me that?
Well, it gets worse around the holidays, and I think this year, especially when people ask like, "Are you going home for the holidays?" It's like that scene in the Christian Bale Batman where the Joker's holding all the hospitals hostage, and Bruce Wayne crashes his car, and it's like, "You think I should go to the hospital?" And they're like, "You don't watch the news, do you?" That's always what I want to say when a Japanese person goes, "Are you going home?" It's like, "Are you not paying attention?"
I'm like, "Are you going to see your parents?" I'm like, I want to see my parents today.
So badly.
I haven't seen them in 2 years, so I would love to go, but I cannot. And they don't understand. And it's very weird on both sides. I got my parents saying, can you come home? It's like, it's not a matter whether I can come home. It's a matter where I can get back here with no issue.
But it is possible if you've got loads of money.
Exactly.
Is that about right?
Pretty much. If you're able to get the PCR tests in the right amount of time, if you're able to afford to lose 10 working days, 10 days of work, if you are able to deal with the fact that if you're on a 2-week vacation, you might be quarantined for a good chunk of it or most of it, then absolutely you can go back and forth as you please. And that's why there was one person I found very well meaning, had a whole game plan she put on Trello, like, here's what you can do, da 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 da, and that's like $1,000 to just leave and go back, let alone the ticket. So it's like, I'll just wait till I can just come and go as I please.
Yeah.
Well, so you wrote about some of the restrictions that prevented foreigners from coming in and made it financially impossible for foreigners to go out and come back, but they are trying to ease those restrictions. There were some new rules that kicked in this month that said that people staying up to 3 months or longer for business or for work, will only have to quarantine for 3 days in principle. And they're continuing to limit the number of international arrivals to, I think, 3,500 a day. And that includes Japanese citizens arriving from abroad. So that's 3,500 a day, but the immigration authorities say that during this whole pandemic period, 370,000 people who had permission to stay in Japan, who had already been granted either, through residency or already had their visas, 370,000 people were unable to enter during the period of stricter restrictions.
That's the thing. It's a very weird situation where they're saying you can do it, but these are all of the things you have to remember and keep in mind. And I feel like that's kind of a roundabout way of restricting people of doing it. You know what I mean? The way I look at it is, and this is what I tell my parents, unless I can just show proof of vaccination, leave, come back, take a quick test, come back, then it's not really worth me leaving at this time. Even for vacation.
Well, that was my experience of going to Spain the other week. I had to show that I had had 2 jabs of a COVID-19 vaccine. That part's relevant. And in Spain, I had to say where I was going to be staying and had a little QR code where I uploaded that proof of double jabbing. And I had to certify that I didn't have COVID symptoms, but I didn't have to take a test.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the way back into the UK, I had to take a lateral flow test, which is the mood ring of COVID tests. Means nothing. And paid £20 for the privilege.
Mm-hmm.
So there are ways to do this, and Japan hasn't really found a way that works yet. Their own vaccine passport still doesn't exempt you from quarantine on the way back in.
I don't even know how to get a vaccine passport, honestly, and I've been vaccinated since July.
Do you think that the way that Japan has handled the pandemic and the way that they've treated foreigners during it will affect the long-term desire for new foreigners to want to come to Japan?
I feel like yes and no. Because there have already been reports of people who were trying to study in Japan, change their plans to go to Korea or China instead because the restrictions are no longer as large. But I think how do I say this? In my opinion, I feel like this was Japan's moment, especially considering it was an Olympic year, to shine. This was their moment to kind of show we are diligent, we are organized, we have a through line. And they didn't really do that, especially with the advent of the Olympics. And so they kind of I feel like in the beginning, they kind of got away with it because, they were wearing masks at first and, there weren't that many entries yet, but then the Diamond Princess thing happened, then it just kind of tumbled from there. And I feel like for the first time, the world has gotten a glimpse of, the bureaucracy doesn't work as efficiently as it should. But
so what you're saying is it's not really a question of attitude so much as competency that's let Japan down.
Exactly. It's competency mixed with a bit of attitude and a splash of xenophobia.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. They're pretty inept, but there's a little bit of spiciness to that ineptitude.
It's just you know what I mean? It's a little spicy, which, not what I would want in this situation. But yeah, but you're always going to have those hardcore Japanophiles who just don't care and who don't care now and won't care when they finally decide to get here. So
I have a question for the both of you, which is, as 2 non-Japanese people who have stayed in Japan during the pandemic, where lots of people have left and no new blood has come in, have you noticed a change in the opportunities or the nightlife, or is it different? Are private English lesson prices going up because there's not as many new students that are charging 1,000 yen?
I'm just gonna jump in with a callback right now and go, you don't watch the news, do you?
Nightlife.
Nightlife.
When?
English lesson prices going up? Up, Ollie.
Okay. The most thing I can say I had as far as nightlife would have to be when me and my friends went to the Tokyo Whiskey Library in Omotesando, but that was like a month ago, and that was me and 2 friends.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know.
So
yeah,
all right, well, I was potentially I thought there'd be some positives that there aren't as many foreigners spoiling the view, but clearly not.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know. That's the thing. It's not a matter of like whether there are. I just wouldn't know. And then you have Japanese people who don't even know the borders are closed. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah. Well, going back to this idea of whether or not it'll affect people wanting to come to Japan long term, I have the general sense that like the average person overseas who wants to come to Japan might not be like, they might not be an unseen Japan reader. Like their only relationship to Japan might be through one of Japan's cultural exports,
of course,
like
right.
anime or so they have this image in their head of the Japan that they want to go to, but don't actually get a sense of what it's like to live here until they get here. So my suspicion would be that, in another what's the generation cycle for a new crop of foreigners in Japan? 5 years? Less?
I would say 5, or I'll say 3 to 5 years, right? Because usually when you have a lot of these ALT jobs or just general jobs, usually you can renew a contract up to 3 or 5 years if they don't leave ahead of time.
So those people who are going to be applying in 3 years or 5 years, are they even going to be aware of the fact that the people who were accepted this generation ended up getting shafted?
The only way they would keep up with it, the only way they would know is if they keep up with the news. But if they're only getting like their idea of Japan through anime, and I mean, that's the sad part about Cool Japan. All they export is anime, but they don't pay their animators. But like, if that's the only thing that they get it through, they're probably not aware of that at all.
And don't forget, we've all met people who they never actually had a plan to come to Japan.
Exactly.
Like the category of people who are just like, yeah, I mean, I was approaching 30 and I wanted a career change, and I thought, yeah, fuck it, I'll go, teach abroad. And there was, an English school that was advertising. Like, I think we might be underestimating the number of people who simply don't care about Japan at all,
right,
but go because it seems vaguely interesting. Yeah. These people don't even read the general news about Japan now.
Exactly. Let alone take a quick, little Berlitz book with them so they can order for themselves. So when they're in Japan,
They're definitely not listening to this podcast. Although if there are any listeners that have changed their mind about moving to Japan or changed their plans as a result of policy and ineptitude, let us know.
Yeah, we would love to talk to people who've had that kind of experience.
JapanByRiverCruise.com and click on the Fax Us button.
Especially if they've ended up in Korea or China. That's one of the funniest things to me is that, I've encountered this in a bunch of different ways. We encountered it when we did stand-up in Korea.
Yeah.
I encountered it when I was doing those pilot recruitment interview videos, and I had to interview these pilots in Korea about what their life was like and why they chose it. And one guy just straight up said, I always wanted to go to Japan, but it was too hard. So Korea.
Exactly. I mean,
we had this with the other stand-ups as well, right? They were like, oh man, like they really treated us like we'd won the Asia lottery. Like the roulette ball had landed.
Well, they treated us like we were stuck up. They were like, oh, you're the good foreigners in Asia. You're the ones who got into Japan.
Well, there's a huge dynamic. I mean, you think about the fact that Japanese involves 3 different writing systems. You think about how Japan is an island separate from Asia. You think about, or rather, at least in Western media, Japan has kind of been for years, even before what they call the Hallyu wave, like the Korean wave, right? Like, it's been exalted. I think even since the post-war, now that I think about it, especially in the 80s when everyone had money, as this beacon of tradition and modernity and discipline and glamour
and money.
Korea not so much, because Korea in the 80s, from what I understand, was a very different time than what the 80s was like in Japan. So
well, when we were in Korea, we didn't even have that sense, and all the Korean comics were like, "Oh, you guys have to know, that Japan is the better one, and Korea is considered lesser." And we were all like, "How would we know that? We got into Japan. Korea wasn't even our safety country."
Exactly. And also, you were just surprised that people acknowledged that you thought you were better than them, but this time for a different reason. Thanks very much for listening to this episode 108 of Japan by River Cruise. If you are a listener but not a Twitter follower, then please do follow our Twitter account at JBRCpod on Twitter.
You can also find this week's guest, Thalia, on Twitter at Thalia the Writer. We'll link it in the show notes. Thalia, we'll be looking forward to your next work for Unseen Japan.
Thanks for having me, and please be sure to check out my new articles coming out.
Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next week.